We're delighted this evening to have John Buchanan here with us. For those of you who don't know, John played first-class cricket for Queensland. He coached Queensland to 2 Sheffield Shield titles, but of course is best known for coaching Australia between 1999 and 2007. An unfortunate period of dominance that included 2 World Cup wins and 3 Ashes wins and a world record number of Test victories. So, John, first of all, thank you for coming on board this evening. We much appreciate it. And perhaps before we get started, given the world situation at the moment, do you want to just give us a quick rundown of how things are where you are and how you're coping with the lockdown?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And given that accent, maybe we should really sort of 2005 Ashes.
World Cup जीता लिया. Ponting अनेक ऐसे.
And look, maybe if you're not actually asking a question, it might be best to mute your speakers because.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'll do, John. I'll quickly mute everyone and then I'll unmute you and I. How about that?
All right, okay.
How would I put a mute check?
And right, how's that, Alex? All good?
I can hear you if you can hear me.
Yeah, got you. Right.
Okay. So yeah, I was just going to say, how are you doing with the coronavirus situation?
Yes, look, in Queensland and I suppose across Australia, it's not as bad as other parts of the world, that's for sure. We are in lockdown, so that does mean really you're only supposed to leave your house for essential services, you know, food, if you have to go to work, medical appointments and so on. You are allowed out to exercise, but only in basically household groups. Can visit family, but while it's lockdown, it is reasonably flexible. It's not quite the right word, but it's reasonably livable, I suppose. Again, not so bad as everybody else, but and again, there's right at the moment an increasing push, a bit like the US. I mean, you're close to that. The economy is struggling and businesses are struggling, and with the numbers sort of low and potentially sort of plateauing and flattening the curve, as I'd say, that there is an increasing push to relax the lockdown and sort of try and get the economy back up and going. But yeah, still, I think our government, or federal government, and certainly state government, still pretty strong on keeping it as lockdown for as long as possible. So yeah, and I guess the other part about that is just keeping an eye on the rest of the world and where that's progressing too. So for various countries that are releasing the gates a little bit to see how that progresses. But overall, pretty good.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear you're safe and sound. Anyway, so we'll get into the questions because obviously we don't have a huge amount of time.
Yeah, sure.
So obviously you coached and worked with some of the all-time greats of the sport. But I just wanted to ask you about the 2 captains that you had under you, predominantly Steve Waugh and Ricky Ponting. What were they like as captains, as leaders? Perhaps a little bit about their strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps a little bit about your relationship with them and how your relationship and your role as coach perhaps changed when the transition happened from Steve Waugh to Ricky Ponting.
Yeah, right, Alex. Look, yeah, so I started with Stephen, obviously, in November 99. I started my first test match was in Brisbane. We were playing Pakistan, and Stephen really had only been in the captaincy role for not even half a dozen tests, I don't think, maybe 4 or thereabouts. And it was interesting. There was 2 other player test debutants that game. One was Adam Gilchrist, who I believe you've had the pleasure of speaking with, and another chap by the name of Scott Muller, who played 2 test matches, the second test match being the famous can't bowl, can't. Phil can't throw, all those sort of things, and put down to a cameraman, Joe the cameraman. But Stephen, I think, was a strong advocate for me coming into the role. I mean, the person before me was Jeff Marsh, who had been coach or appointed as coach when Mark Taylor was captain. And Swampy, just a very good, really good person, and just tried to do everything he could for his team, and just passionate about Australia. But he found himself in a personal situation which required him to leave the job. So when Stephen came in, one of his mantras was about taking the road less travelled, and I guess what I'd been doing in Queensland was different to all other coaches around Australia. And I think it rang a chord with Stephen. So he was, I think, a strong advocate for me to get the role. And you know, in sort of sporting teams and semi-professional sporting teams, that the coach-captain relationship needs to be very strong. I mean, it doesn't mean that there are not differences, and you know, certain times where you want to go in different directions. But overall, if that relationship is strong, then it really makes a difference to the dressing room. Because if it's not, and I had a couple of examples where it wasn't. One was when I was coaching Middlesex, and the other was coaching Kolkata Knight Riders. When that relationship is not strong, it doesn't take long for the dressing room to feel that tension, and it really does begin to divide up the room. But Stephen was a guy that led by example. He didn't sort of spend a lot of time talking with people. When he talked, it was pretty clipped but to the point. And you know, his other, I guess, attribute was that he was certainly a person of history, and I guess that it was what also drew us together, because when I first spoke to the team in Brisbane in that first test match, I told them, apart from other bits and pieces, again, they knew who I was by that stage. I'd coached Queensland for 5 years. But I did tell them basically that I believed that they'd only scratched the surface about what they could achieve, and that we were then going to go on a journey to Everest together. And so didn't know how long that would be, or you know, when it would finish in terms of the amount of games. But hopefully by the time that we finished our time together, you know, we would have changed the game in some way, shape or form, and related that back to the 1948 Australian team, the Invincibles, to say the same sort of thing. We may not be called the Invincibles, but hopefully because of the way that we played the game and did certain things, that we'd also be given a label. So that was kind of where we started. And as I said, Stephen and I pursued captain of the one-day side by Ricky Pond in 2000. And then Ricky took over after 2004, the full under Stephen. He'd also been part of a young player in the Tasmanian side, David Boone, a few other international players down there. So he was being, in a sense, groomed for a long period of time. And so the transition wasn't necessarily too difficult, although it was a little bit difficult when we had two captains, one of the one-day side and one on the test side, even though they were quite similar type of people. But probably the main difference I felt with Ricky compared to Stephen was, I said Stephen was, in a sense, short on his words, or short on what he needed to say. Ricky was probably quite the reverse. He loved talking. He loved being around individual players. He loved chatting with them. He loved talking cricket. And so he would spend a lot of time with each of his players, really trying to understand them, and particularly in just talking batting and technique and grips and a whole range of different things. So he brought probably a more consensual approach to his leadership, but nonetheless, if I just give you a quick story on Ricky, which to some degree reinforced how Stephen approached the game, but it's more about Ricky. So 2006-7, we were playing England, and this was the second test in Adelaide, hence the scoreboard in the background. And England made 500 odd in their first innings, and we'd sort of got to be, I can't quite remember the score, but I think we might have been, 3 down or something in the third day, 2 down in the third day. So he gathered everybody together and basically said, look, we're still a chance to win the game. And I was certainly supportive of that approach because, it was England we were playing. Sorry, Alex. So there's always a chance to be beaten no matter what they make. And so he said, the job today is that all batsmen need to occupy the crease, but not only occupy the crease, we need to score runs so that we can put ourselves in a position possibly to win the game, on the 5th day. And so that kind of set the scene for this was the 3rd day. And sometime after tea, Ricky Ponting was dismissed and he stormed off the field, a very angry person, stormed into the dressing room, basically rearranged the furniture a bit in there with his bat and said a few loud words which carried to the members area there. And while that may not necessarily be the actions of a leader, you would think sometimes, it was Ricky and that in his mind was leadership, that if you ask any of your team to do something, then you should be able to do it yourself. So he was very disappointed in what he hadn't done for the team, and that was to stay at the crease and score a heap of runs. However, if you look at the scoreboard on that 3rd day, I think he'd made 142 of 160 deliveries or 180 deliveries. But in his mind, he'd set himself to make 250 and put Australia in a commanding position. But that in his mind was what a leader should be doing, leading by example, but certainly in his mind that the level at which he wanted to play the game was incredibly high. So, look, both incredibly passionate people, very good leaders, lead by example, had, most of the time total support of the team. Again, as a leader, you're always going to find people who are not necessarily going to like what you do. But overall, you had a very good, or both of them had a very good way with the group and consequently helped with the results that we got.
I was lucky enough to be in Australia in that 2006-7 Ashes series. And for the 5th day of Adelaide, me and my mates decided to go to the golf course because it was a nailed on draw. And we walked off and walked into the bar, and I think the Aussie openers were just going out to bat, and it got worse from there, didn't it? But I don't know if you've seen the Amazon series, The Test, John, but I think one of the interesting things about that, and I think Justin Langer is probably the star of that show and is probably the main man. But one of the interesting things about that is watching Justin Langer set about specific, trying to implement specific duties, whether that's one-on-one stuff with like Usman Khawaja working on technical stuff, or in his creating a new team identity. So I was hoping you might be able to give us a couple of examples of when, as an Australian coach, you wanted to implement specific things, whether it was one-on-one technical stuff, a tactical point of view, stuff that really worked and came into fruition, and you went home with them, but they sort of proud at the job you'd done. And maybe if you could give maybe a quick example of when you tried to implement something like that and it didn't quite come off.
Yes, look, I think from the outset, as I said to you, said to the group, we're going to go on a journey to Everest. So when I started with the team, I decided that I'd take about, as it worked out, about 9 months to really get a good feel for how the Australian team operated. Because again, having coached Queensland, there are a number of players that would come back to the Queensland team, the likes of a Healy or a McDermott, Jimmy Maher, those sort of guys, Stuart Law, who'd either played in the Test group or the one-day group, and they'd give you a bit of an insight how the Australian team was running. So when I took over the team, I thought a handle on at least, as I said, they're only scraping the surface, but I felt I needed to be inside the group far longer to make a stronger or get a stronger appreciation for how the culture works. So, we had the 2 Test series in Australia and the one-day series against India and Pakistan, which we won all the 6 Test matches, and so that began it continued the run. There was 1 Test match before I started, and then those 6 Test matches made it 7 in a row as we headed to winning whatever it was, 16 or 17 in a row. And we won all our one-day games apart from one. Then we went to New Zealand. So it gave me again an opportunity to watch players on tour and how that might work. And at the same stage, I suppose, begin to inject some of the things that I thought were important to the way that the culture could change or certainly could be challenged. And so on that tour, we won 3 Test matches and won the one days. And so to give you an example on that tour about some of the things that I was really wanting to introduce over time, and that was about the whole person. So it was trying to take them outside of the dressing room as individuals. Most players are very comfortable in the dressing room, in inverted commas. In other words, if people want to engage them in cricket talk, specific games and so on, they're reasonably comfortable. But it did seem to me that one of the roles that a coach should be doing was to grow the person. So try to encourage them to have broader horizons rather than just the sport that they were playing. So we embarked upon, or I certainly encouraged everybody on that New Zealand tour, first of all, we had them to get up in front of the rest of the group and provide 2 stories. One, and nothing to do with cricket. One was something that they were really passionate about and liked doing. And then a second was something about themselves that they were prepared to share amongst a group that they probably hadn't shared before. And so that was, we had people like Andrew Simons who gave everybody with diagrams and implements a lesson in how to thread a hook using a prawn so that you could best bait your fishing rod or your fishing line to catch fish. And we had Jason Gillespie and Michael Kasovich, who were right into World Championship Wrestling at the time, demonstrating a whole set of holds that they thought were pretty important, that might come in useful in a dressing room stoush at any stage. And then down to someone like Michael Bevan, who was a very good singer, but he talked about his poetry and then shared a lot of insights about him and his family. So that was something I was always really pushing hard for and trying to encourage every time that we had an opportunity to do that. In that tour as well in New Zealand, we had our first Test match in Dunedin. So I'd read up on the albatross, which is an incredible type of bird with massive wingspan, and Dunedin was one of the few places in the world that you could access it by land. So 2 days out from a Test match, we'd finished training, and I said, right, well, we're all heading off to see the albatross. And of course, that met with mixed reactions, and I'm still a bit of a rookie coach, and so we had 2 buses that were going to drive us down to the albatross rookery. But as I said, I'm still a rookie as well, and so I had Shane Warne driving one bus and I was driving the other bus, because in those days that's what happened. You had 2 sets of vans, and that would transport you from hotel to ground and wherever else you needed to go. So anyway, 20 minutes into the drive, Warnie pulled his vehicle up, and of course I couldn't pass him. I was behind, so I got out of the vehicle and went round to Warnie's bus, and I'm thinking to myself as I'm coming closer to the window to ask him, why he'd stopped. And here I was. I'm only not even 9 months into the job, and Warne, played 10 years or just about 10 years of international cricket by that stage, and a bit of a ledge. Was this the time to really broach the notion of a whole person, take you outside your comfort zone, Warnie, learn something about life and learn something about the country, learn something about, these incredible birds. So as I got to the window, he jumped in the conversation before I had a chance. So I'm not going any further. So I figured right at that moment that this wasn't the time to try and embark on a discussion and debate about developing you as a person, Warnie. So anyway, I said, right, well, you take your bus back to the hotel because there'll be others that may be like you, and I'll take the rest of the crew on. So when I'm telling this in front of an audience, I will then go and say that I drove the bus down to the Rookery by myself. Everybody else had taken off back to the hotel. It wasn't quite that way, but I had half a dozen takers. Steve Waugh was one of those. The rest of the story, though, was that, we got to the Rookery late in the afternoon, and the Rookery had closed. They actually had fences around this thing. I hadn't read all the story about the Rookery, and the fence was closed and we couldn't get in. So, as a rookie coach, I'm thinking, well, how can I rescue this situation? So I kind of looked up in the sky and saw these birds flying around and told everybody that it's amazing. I told you these birds are incredible. Their wingspan, they've got to be 4 or 5 miles up in the air, and that's the only way we can see them. And of course, one of the players quickly chips in and says, mate, they're just seagulls. So a bit of a story in terms of, some of the things that I was always trying to do and continue to do that. Where it really didn't work, that sort of approach, which was a bit part and parcel, or a very good example of why that 2005 Ashes series didn't work for us in England, was that, again, same thing, sort of whole person. And this time it was, I had a whole series of words. So I'd put together 2 or 3 words for the next team meeting and encourage everybody then to either put those words into a sentence or a song or a poem or whatever they wanted to do, so they could demonstrate they understood the meaning of the word. But I really got some pushback from the young guys straight away, the Clarks, the Watsons, Brett Lee and so on. And what I didn't do then was say, okay, well, maybe there's another way of going about this. But it seemed like they were pretty adamant about this was a load of rubbish and was not going to help them play a cover drive or help them bowl the ball at 150 k's an hour. So why should we be doing it? So it kind of dropped into the background, and that became symptomatic, I think, of part of the culture that wasn't working on that Ashes tour. Now, irrespective of whether they got the culture right and players were playing right, England were playing exceptionally well. So who knows whether that would have made a difference. But certainly in terms of when we were playing well, before and then after, this sort of cultural change and trying to encourage players to look outside their own little bubble and experience other places or other people was part and parcel of why we were, I think, reasonably successful.
I'm glad you brought up the 2005 Ashes, actually, John. I wasn't going to mention it, but I was just watching a cheeky little DVD, actually, before we started. I don't know if you can see that one. I'll tell you what, now, I think we've got a quick question. Bijou, I'm going to unmute you, mate, and I think you might have a quick question.
Sure.
Okay, mate, Bijou, go ahead.
Hello, John. In our team, we have fines meeting after a game. I mean, you could receive fines for all sorts of things. For example, dropping a catch or damage to team property or failing to complete a fifer or just bad grammar in our WhatsApp group. So my question to you is, if you were to run such a fines meeting during your time with the Australian cricket team, who would you fine and what for?
Yeah, look, Bijou, I find that always a really interesting question. And I suppose, in club cricket, we would do that. I'm pretty sure when I took over the Queensland team, that was sort of there at the time. So to answer your question directly, I think in terms of team culture, Warney would have been paying out quite a bit. Andrew Simons would have been paying out quite a bit because he would sort of push the boundaries a little in terms of enjoying himself at night. But other people, such as, the Pontings and the Langers and the Haydens and the Gilchrists, McGraths, etc., they probably wouldn't figure too much on the fine sheet. But let me say that what I did, particularly with the Australian team, where we could or where we felt it was important, is that we turned the fine system on its head. And so what we did with it, the so-called fine system was, and take one step back, basically a fine system in the end, in that sort of environment, tends to bring everybody's attention to some of the things that are not working, some of the things that are not right, or some of the behavioural issues that might be occurring. And if that plus, it can somewhat degenerate into a bit of a farce sometimes. I do recall within the Queensland Bulls, when I was coaching Queensland, we would have a safari suit, and so while it wasn't necessarily a fine system, the safari suit was a vote of the group, and of course the safari was just one of the old suits, travelling suits of the 70s, and here we are in the mid-90s. And of course, at the end of the game, there would be a vote on the safari suit because we'd then be going out that night, and because they're young blokes, you're going to clubs and everything else, where they're really trying to make an impression on the locals. But the winner of the safari suit, that's what they had to wear. So that was always something not necessarily wanting to be won, but happened to be the good or misfortune of some to do that. But to go back to the Australian team, what we tried to do then is one, if there was good performance, so there could be 5 wickets or it could be hundreds, it could be catches and so on. We would recognise that, and then it would be everybody else that got fined because they weren't able to match the bar of the standard that had been set by one individual, maybe 2 individuals. So the ones that were actually performing well didn't get fined, everybody else had to contribute. Or we did it around, behaviour or a coach's view as well. So we try to tip the notion of fines around to the notion of what was highlighted was something that we really believe was good or we needed to do, and so everybody else made the contribution.
Yeah, we have a duck costume that somebody has to wear at the end of the season, whoever's accrued the most ducks. And I'm just going to, talking of the duck suits, one of the guys that wore it for a large portion of our end of season drinks, Jason Bell, a fellow Australian, he did have a question, John. I know we're getting close to time running out, so I thought I'd let him ask one. This is one you weren't prepared for, but I'm sure you get a lot, John, so hopefully you don't mind Jace asking it. Go ahead, Jace.
Hey, John. It's a 2-part question. Just answer what you have time for. I just wanted to ask, what was your relationship like with Shane Warne, 1 as a player and 2 as a person?
Yeah, look, the easiest way for me to summarise that is that, Warney is great at the game. There's absolutely no question about that. And therefore deserves every accolade he gets about what he did on the cricket field. He and McGrath, this is the cricketer first of all, just had to be admired for the fact that what I found, that they were able to compartmentalise the game so well, so that when we'd have a team meeting, certainly Warney would be sort of scratching his head and wondering why we're sitting in the team meeting and making everything so complicated in terms of looking at vision and data and stats and so on. But what he didn't realise, or if he did, he didn't admit to realising it, is that he had so much stored up in his head that he could access once he moved onto the cricket field, and McGrath was exactly the same. I didn't see too many other players in our Australian mix that were anywhere near that, and so hence the reason for trying to bring everybody up to date. So his ability then to move into a game, onto a cricket field, and particularly if he was bowling, what he would do then would either be able to call up a situation or call up the player in his own mind and understand and know what it was that he needed to bowl to potentially get that player out. And if he hadn't seen somebody or wasn't quite clear, then he had the skill to bowl leg spin, as he would term, he would move the ball across a player's stumps. So in other words, he would bowl outside leg stump, then at leg stump, then about middle stump, then about off stump, and then outside off stump. And wasn't worried about whether or not where the balls went. He was just watching the batsman and how that batsman was responding. So from a cricket point of view, from a bowling point of view, there was no coaching. As a batsman, we spent a lot of time working with him, yet he was one of those people that was a poor learner. He just would return to whatever he was used to doing, no matter how much you try to put time into him. In terms of the team and the culture, I always called him a conditional team player. And that was, the conditions were, if he was going well and things were going well, then he was a real collaborator, cooperator, trying to help everybody wherever he could. When things weren't going well, he was quite the opposite, so he became quite divisive, fragmenting, blaming people, particularly coach or captain. And so with Warnie then, because of that conditional nature of his, you rode an emotional roller coaster. So when asked often about him, would he make a great Australian captain? He knew the game inside out. He could read the game, but as a leader, he could never engender the same sort of unity that a Steve Moore or Ricky Ponting would do, because you ride that emotional roller coaster with him, and some would be with him some days and others not other days. So as a captain and leader, I didn't think he would be a good choice. So from my point of view, just again a quick story. Probably where we got off on the wrong foot was when as I said, going back to when I started with the team in '99. There was probably only 4 or 5 players that were considered at that point in time fixtures in the side. So that was the 2 War boys, Warren, McGrath and Slater. And the rest were still finding their feet or trying to establish themselves in that Australian side. So we toured India in 2001. So soon after that, I mentioned the New Zealand tour and so on. And this was when we'd won 16 test matches in a row, one in Mumbai, and then we went to Calcutta and memorable test match there where we made 440, bowled them out for 170, had a lead of 270, so we enforced the follow on immediately, and then in the end got beaten in that test match. And through that game, I remember Steve Waugh coming to me at different times and kind of saying, "Can you speak to Warnie? He's delirious out there. He's telling me to, I'll bowl full tosses, head high, and eventually we'll get somebody caught on the boundary." But what had happened leading into that tour, Warnie had, I think, had an shoulder injury or finger injury. But at that stage in his career, he still wasn't a great trainer. So he was carrying a lot of weight and he was unfit. And so it was one test all. I had to go to a media conference, and I'd spoken to the chairman of selectors and Stephen's captain and said, I'll probably we've tried everything here. If nobody's getting through to him, I might say something in the media conference. So anyway, somebody asked me, how's Warren going? And I just said something along the lines of, well, I reckon if he was a little bit fitter, he might be okay. And so next day, headlines were, Coach says Warren is fat. And so that probably certainly didn't help our relationship in India, because he didn't talk to me again for the rest of the tour. But nonetheless, there are times, obviously, where we had good long chats just, off the field and watching games and different things. But other times, we were certainly locking horns on the way that the game should be played and how we should be going about preparing for the game and so on. So, again, like everybody, like all of you, we just can't get along with everybody all the time. And as a coach, in the end, you're not there for a popularity contest. You're there to try to challenge the team, try to challenge the performances of the group. And while you would like to be able to be popular with everyone in the group, it's just not possible. And so do the job the best you can, and in the end, if that's not good enough, you get moved on. If it is good enough, then you'll get some good results, and those sort of players still want to be part of that, and therefore will find a way to be part of that. And generally, as I mentioned, just to finish off, after about 2 and a bit years, probably getting on for 3 years, we gradually began to get a stronger core group in the team. So Warren's influence in being one of the senior players was certainly quite a deal lessened as the likes of Hayden became a fixture, Langer became a fixture, Gilchrist became a fixture, Andrew Simons eventually became a fixture, Gillespie a fixture, and all these guys brought great character and great attributes into the side, which just didn't allow Warren to have the same influence that he had previously.
Well, that's all been fantastic, John. I'm very conscious of the time. I should tell everyone that John was only contractually obliged to give us 15 minutes of his time, and he's been on for nearly 45 minutes with us, John. So on behalf of everyone at the club, and we've had 30 odd people here this evening, thank you very much for giving us your time and your insights and some good stories. So thank you very much, and we hope that you will stay well in the coming weeks and months.